I think it's about damn time I did this. My last two Uncharted reviews got released more than 2 years ago, so I'd say the rest is long overdue. But why did it take so long to get here in the first place? Well, there's the fact that my PS3 disc for Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception would work once, then never work again, and when I replaced it, the second disc came with the same exact problem. Because of this, I got the PS4 version maybe a month after I released the review for Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, and this was unfortunately around the time I got burnt out on the series, so I only got to the Citadel in Syria and quit shortly afterwards. I have replayed the first third so many times without getting further, but this time I was finally able to finish it, meaning I could finally make this review. I don't quite remember how the PS3 version compares to the PS4 iteration, so this might not be the most accurate criticism of the game, especially because the PS4 version is 60 frames per second and has better graphics, so it's inherently better than its PS3 counterpart. Either way, the more important question is how it fares against the previous entries, and I replayed those right before I finally finished this one, meaning I can compare them easier. So, how does Drake's Deception fare against the underwhelming Drake's Fortune and the fantastic Among Thieves? Let's find out by reviewing.
Sic Parvis Magna. It means greatness from small beginnings.
Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception got released on the PlayStation 3 on November 1st of 2011. It was of course made by the legendary Naughty Dog, who made major bank off the previous games, and this one supposedly sold better with over 9 million. It wasn't received as well, however, getting way fewer Game of the Year awards, those rather going to Arkham City, Portal 2 and Skyrim, but it still had fantastic scores across the board. The version I'm playing is part of the Nathan Drake collection made by Bluepoint Games, who remastered the original trilogy on the PlayStation 4. That collection got released on October 7th in 2015. It's generally regarded as a fantastic remaster of the games, especially for adding 60 frames per second.
No, you two are going to Syria. We're heading to France. Look, we track down these clues. We find Lawrence's lost city. I'm sure of it.
The story primarily follows Nathan Drake and Victor Sullivan, who are confronted by old enemies named Catherine Marlowe and Talbot. This awakens old goals, as these enemies are in possession of a cipher disk that Nate has sought after since childhood. You see, Nate's ring, formerly belonging to Francis Drake, is the key to operating the cipher disk that can decode a Nokian script. This is important because that's the key to finding Ubar, nicknamed the Atlantis of the Sands, which Francis Drake gave up on finding. Nate and Sully also get help from Chloe Fraser and the newly introduced Charlie Cutter, and their goal is to find Ubar before the enemy does.
Now we just follow him back to that hole.
You do realize you make everything sound dirty.
I do?
While I enjoyed the writing of this game more than Drake's Fortunes, it doesn't quite hold a candle to the writing in Among Thieves. The biggest reason for that is the villains, who are on the same level as Gabriel Roman and the Talk Navarro, if not worse. They're just not interesting whatsoever, nor are they intimidating in the slightest. Like, Marlowe is just annoying with her English accent, and don't even get me started on Talbot. Why is he even in the game? Oh yeah, so you can have a slightly formidable opponent at the end, because Marlowe obviously can't fight. Even then, Talbot is an absolute joke, in what's the easiest and most underwhelming final boss fight in the series. Soren Lazarevich might not have been all that interesting either, but at least he was intimidating, and had a pretty good final boss fight that actually made me feel nervous. And say what you want about Harry Flynn, but he was pretty memorable, with a somewhat fun personality. But enough ranting about the villains, how's the rest of the story? Of course, the villains majorly drag it down since they're a big part of it, but the story is still pretty interesting, and the main characters are fun as always. It was interesting to explore Nathan Drake's and Victor goddamn Sullivan's obsessive nature, because when you think about it, there was no reason for Nate or Sully to find Ubar. Their lives were on the line, and all it did was let the villains exploit the powers from an ancient civilization, which also led to its destruction. You can argue that our quote-unquote heroes are actually villains, or at least unhealthy people. They do find pleasure in killing after all, which Nate was called out on by Lazarevich in Among Thieves. It makes them grey characters, which I can appreciate, and their dynamic is by far the best aspect of this game's writing. Sully actually gains a way more important role than ever before, and we even get to see how Nate met him when they were younger. I like that about this story, that the past had a lot of influence to make the story happen in the first place. It's just a shame that the villains drag it down. As for more minor characters, I'm glad they brought Chloe and Elena back, who are still nice characters, but in this game I definitely like the new character of Cutter even more. He was pretty funny and surprisingly smart too. It's just a shame him and Chloe were completely written out halfway into the story. You can compare that to Sully being quickly cut from the story in Among Thieves, but at least he showed up at the end. I didn't really care for the subplots where characters were being mind controlled, except when Nate was influenced by cactus juice without us knowing. That led to a pretty cool twist. The game had weird pacing at times, and while the ship section had cool moments, it was too long and had no bearing on the plot. I'd say the ending was fairly good though, maybe not the best way to cap off the trilogy, but that's what A Thief's End is for.
No.
The gameplay is mostly the same, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as it's more akin to Among Thieves and not Drake's Fortune, which is luckily the case. I'm not sure if it's the 60 FPS, but Drake's Deception's gunplay feels super smooth. It's probably part of the reason, but I'm pretty sure Naughty Dog deliberately made it smoother in the first place. The gameplay has some new additions like throwing grenades back at enemies, which I didn't figure out until pretty late into the game, so that's a shame because it's a really useful mechanism. This game also added horse riding, which controls far better than the jet ski from Drake's Fortune and gave me major Indiana Jones vibes, which an Uncharted game should give. Melee combat has also gotten a few tweaks. You can for instance throw people in a desired direction and smash them with objects depending on the environment. While that's pretty cool and all, there are way too many instances of hand-to-hand combat, and they usually last unnecessarily long. Sadly, weapon and ammo pickups haven't changed at all, so picking up unwanted weapons instead of ammo is still an ongoing problem. The puzzles, that were good in previous games, never really evolved much from Drake's Fortune to Among Thieves, but I think Drake's Deception has the most interesting puzzles yet. I legitimately had to think while doing most of them, and Drake's Journal rarely ever gave me a straight answer. That being said, getting into this game's Lost City, Ubar, felt way too easy compared to Shambhala, which required even more climbing, puzzle solving, and combat to get into, even after you had found the hidden entrance. Getting into Ubar, on the other hand, was a piece of cake, so the impact wasn't as great, but I can't deny I was in awe the first time I laid eyes on the city. Speaking of being awestruck, the action set pieces are once again absolutely insane. Highlights include the burning chateau, the sinking ship, skydiving into the desert, the horse riding sequence, and escaping the sinkhole at the end. These were all breathtaking moments that made me smile and utter words of amazement at times. Because of the Uncharted game's structure, there will be unavoidable repetition, with certain areas overstaying their welcome. That's even the case in Among Thieves, as you spent an extremely long time in Nepal and Tibet. Even though no location in Drake's Deception lasted that long, I still like Nepal and Tibet more than the places that dragged in Drake's Deception. I think it has to do with the pacing. You do spend 2 hours in the sea with no plot progression after all. It didn't help that there was a serious difficulty spike there either. My least favorite part was probably Syria though, as it was pretty uneventful, aside from Cutter being brainwashed, but as I mentioned, I didn't care much for that gimmick. However, there were some places that I really liked, notably France and majority of the Rub al Khali Desert. Overall, I think the game has a good length at about 10 to 12 hours, just like Among Thieves, only the pacing isn't as good. Among Thieves looked absolutely stunning, and knowing Naughty Dog, they wouldn't disappoint in the graphics department, right? Yeah, that's spot on. This game looks incredible. Of course, I did play the PS4 version, so it was bound to look better than originally, and I don't remember how the PS3 version looked in comparison. But hey, if Among Thieves looks great on the PS3 today, surely Drake's Deception does too, and probably better since it's newer. Even if the graphics weren't good, the visuals are, as there's so much detail put into each and every environment. From peacefully taking in the city life to finding yourself in the most dangerous situations, the attention to detail is immaculate. I'm not sure whether this is new, but I love it when Nate knocks out an opponent and immediately catches their weapon, or the fact that you can pull out the pin of a grenade that's attached to an enemy, or when Nate occasionally grabs an object to hit an enemy with. It all flows so naturally. Another nice touch is the camera movement after jumping. It makes it look really authentic. Speaking of camera movements, the direction is really strong, both in cutscenes and gameplay, with good editing and fitting angles. The locations are pretty varied, whether it be the bright white France, the dark London and Syria, or the beautiful desert areas. And let's not forget Ubar, which is one of the prettiest environments I've seen in a game. Aside from a few bugs here and there and a bit too much bloom in some areas, I have no qualms with how the game looks. I have to be honest, while the music is great, I much prefer the Asian-inspired music in Among Thieves than the Arabic-based music in Drake's Deception. I can't count that as a criticism though, because it obviously had to use that music in order to actually fit the locations. There was no track that stood out to me personally, unlike in the previous game, but it was still good music that did a fantastic job at enhancing the atmosphere.
It's not much, is it?
It's enough.
For those of you who've seen my Jak 3 review, remember when I said second installments in trilogies are usually the best, whereas third entries are usually the worst? Well, in Uncharted's case, the first part of that statement is correct. However, I'm glad to say that Drake's Deception is far from being the worst of the trilogy. It's actually not too far off Among Thieves either. The gameplay has improved in certain areas, and hadn't it been for the weird pacing and sometimes random difficulty spikes, I would have probably preferred it. But I'll say it's just as good as it was in its predecessor. So is the presentation, although I much prefer Among Thieves' choice of music. What has clearly weakened though is the writing, which is still good, but it's closer to Drake's Fortune than it is Among Thieves. I give Drake's Deception the rating of 8.5, and before you throw a hissy fit at the big difference in scoring between 2 and 3, let me say that in retrospect I was too generous with Among Thieves' score. I gave it a 9.75, which might be too big of a leap from 6.75 that I gave to Drake's Fortune. Of course, I couldn't find many flaws, but I realized that while it does everything really well, it does play it safe and isn't quite masterpiece level because of Uncharted's inherent repetition. So I'll give it a 9, which is still an amazing score. I'd probably lower Drake's Fortune score to 6.5 after having replayed it again. It's just so inferior on so many levels. I'm so glad I got to finally finish Uncharted 3 and also release this review. Over 2 years since the last Uncharted video. Back then I was anxious to make an Uncharted 4 review, but obviously couldn't. So good thing I can finally do that as well. No way will I wait 2 years for that one. I'm Arcadon, and hopefully you'll see me next time.